The morning was perfect, crisp, quiet, the kind of stillness that only exists when you've put 20 miles of pine trees between yourself and the nearest traffic light. And I was standing at my kitchen window, waiting for the tea to steep, when I saw them. Bright orange banners fluttering like a warning in the breeze, zigzagging across my lower meadow, as if someone had decided to redraw the map of my life while I was sleeping. And as I walked out there, my boots crunching on the frost-tipped grass, my heart started to do this slow, heavy thud against my ribs because my 20-acre estate was supposed to be a sanctuary, not a construction site. I'd spent 15 years and every dime of my savings to escape the noise of the city, building my workshop where I restore vintage furniture, nurturing a garden that fed my soul as much as my body, and I'd been very, very careful to ensure this land was legally excluded from the local homeowners association. But there it was, a raw, jagged trench slicing through the earth like an open wound, and a sign that made my blood turn to ice. Community Safety Initiative, Authorized Gas Line. Installation, Lakeside HOA. I stood there for a long time, just staring at those glossy yellow pipes lying in the dirt like an invading army, and the indignation started to bubble up in my throat, because this wasn't an error, it wasn't a contractor missing a turn. This was a trespass. I've always been a self-reliant woman, the kind who fixes her own roof and doesn't ask for permission to exist. So I went back to the house, dialed the HOA office, and waited through 10 minutes of elevator jazz that sounded like it was designed to make you give up and go away. When a disinterested receptionist finally answered, she treated my trespassing complaint like an inconvenience, clicking her tongue while she pulled up a file that shouldn't have existed. "Ah, yes, Miss Thompson. That's part of our modernization project," she said, her voice dripping with that fake, corporate politeness that usually precedes a lie, and our records show the landowner's signature was obtained weeks ago. I felt the air leave my lungs for a second. A signature? I hadn't signed so much as a birthday card in weeks, let alone a document giving a group of power-tripping suburbanites permission to bulldoze my meadow. I drove into town, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, and marched into that gray little office building nestled between a dry cleaner and a nail salon, refusing to leave until I saw the man in charge. And that's when I met Gregory Langford. He was tall, polished, wearing a suit that cost more than my first truck, and he smiled at me with the kind of unwavering, oily warmth that you only see on politicians and people who are trying to steal your house. Jurisdiction was expanded 2 years ago, Eleanor, he told me, leaning back in his leather chair like he was doing me a favor. "We have your signature on file, and while we appreciate your passion for privacy, the project is for the safety of the entire community." I looked him right in the eye and told him he'd forged it. I told him I'd involve every authority from the sheriff to the state Supreme Court, and for a split second, that polished smile of his stiffened, his eyes turning into cold, hard chips of glass. "I'd advise caution before obstructing a safety project," he said, and the threat was so thinly veiled it felt like a slap in the face. I walked out of there with my mind ablaze, driving back to my property as the shadows grew long and ominous. And that's when I found it. An envelope, partially buried in the red clay near the trench, containing a copy of the authorization. The signature at the bottom was a crude, uneven mess that looked nothing like mine, a blatant, arrogant forgery that proved they didn't just want a gas line. They wanted control. That night, sleep was a ghost that refused to visit me. I sat in my living room with the lights off, looking out at the meadow where the orange banners looked like tiny fires in the moonlight, and I felt vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't just about the dirt or the pipes. It was about the audacity of a group of people who thought they could rewrite the borders of my life just because I lived alone in the woods. By morning, I had my attorney, Margaret Collins, on the phone, a woman as sharp and pragmatic as a butcher's knife, and when she heard about the forgery and the jurisdictional claim, her voice went grave. "Eleanor, they aren't just pushing boundaries, they're obliterating them," she warned. "Organizations like this don't back down once they've broken ground. You need to brace yourself for a war of attrition." I didn't wait for the lawyers to finish their paperwork. I went to town, bought heavy-duty padlocks and lengths of steel chain, and I wrapped that gate so tight it would have taken a tank to get through. But the next morning, the rumble of diesel engines woke me up. A convoy of trucks was idling just outside the gate, men in reflective vests testing the chain, and when I stepped out there with my phone recording everything, the foreman looked at me like I was an obstacle to be cleared rather than a person. "We have permits, ma'am," he said, waving a clipboard like a magic wand. "Remove the gate or we'll involve law enforcement." I told them I was law enforcement at this point, that they were trespassing on private property based on a felony forgery. And for a heartbeat, we just stood there, a standoff in the dust, until one of the trucks began to back toward the gate, as if preparing to ram it. I didn't flinch, even as the steel growled under the pressure of the bumper. And finally, the man with the clipboard signaled the driver to stop, declaring coldly that this isn't over, before the convoy turned around and disappeared into a cloud of red dust. I was trembling with adrenaline, the sanctuary I had spent 15 years building now feeling like a fortress under siege, and I realized that Margaret was right. These people weren't playing by the rules because they had decided the rules didn't apply to them. I spent the afternoon documenting every groove the tires had left, every inch of the trench, and then I drove to the county recorder's office, feeling a chill down my spine when the clerk pulled up my file and frowned. "There was an amendment filed 2 years ago," she whispered, turning the monitor so I could see the HOA letterhead and that same clumsy forgery of my name at the bottom. The HOA hadn't just trespassed on my land. Heath tampered with the official records of the county, weaving a web of lies that made my independence look like a clerical error. I walked out of that building with a mixture of fury and a cold, steely determination. Because if Gregory Langford thought he could bury me under a mountain of fake paperwork, he had severely underestimated the woman who restores furniture for a living. I know how to strip away the varnish to find the rot underneath. When I got home, I found a piece of heavy machinery parked just outside my gate, its massive bucket lowered like a guillotine's blade over my chain, a silent, heavy challenge to my resolve. And instead of calling the police again, I walked into my workshop, grabbed a heavy wrench, and spent the twilight hours quietly disabling that backhoe, so it wouldn't start if they tried to hurl it through my fence. If they wanted to fight, I was done being the victim. I was going to be the storm. The next morning, the black sedan arrived, a sleek, predatory thing that looked entirely out of place on my gravel road. And 2 men in suits stepped out, carrying briefcases like they were bringing peace offerings to a war zone. They didn't lead with threats this time. They led with a generous settlement, a document that promised me financial compensation and integration into the community's prestigious jurisdiction in exchange for permanent access to my land. They spoke about progress and increasing property values, using all the corporate jargon they probably used on elderly couples to get them to sell their memories for a golf course. But I just looked at them across the gate and told them to get off my property. My independence isn't for sale, and neither is my land, I said, my voice steady even though my heart was racing, and I watched the polite mask slip just enough to see the cold calculation underneath. They left, but they left a message behind, the crunch of their tires on the gravel, sounding like a promise of something worse. And that evening I saw the headlights, a slow, rhythmic patrol around the perimeter of my woods, never stopping, just making sure I knew I was being watched. I spent the night reinforcing my defenses, adding extra locks, installing motion sensor lights that flickered like strobe lights every time a deer moved, and even crafting a makeshift alarm system with tripwires and empty cans because the silence of the woods had become a threat. But I wasn't just hiding, I was digging, and as I reviewed the permits Margaret had helped me pull from the county building, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. My property wasn't the first, and it wasn't the only one being modernized against its will. I found a few neighbors who had dealt with the HOA, and while most were too scared to talk, an elderly gentleman named Frank Henderson met me for coffee, his hands shaking as he told me how they'd coerced him into selling a portion of his land years ago. "They act like they're untouchable, Eleanor," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the door. "They use the safety projects as a crowbar to get inside your borders, and once they're in, you never get them out." His words were the fuel I needed, and when I returned to the trench that afternoon, I realized I'd been looking at the wrong thing. I'd been looking at the pipes as a nuisance, but as an engineer's daughter, I started looking at the specs, and something didn't add up. I climbed down into that open pit, the smell of raw earth thick in the air, and I examined the exposed pipe with a flashlight. It wasn't the standard PVC used for residential gas lines. It was larger, heavier, reinforced with a metallic casing designed to withstand extreme industrial pressure. And then I saw them. Wires thin as spider silk, running alongside the main conduit, disappearing into a junction box stamped with a logo I hadn't seen before. Meridian Development. This wasn't a community gas line. It was a high-capacity industrial corridor, and the HOA was just the Trojan horse being used to sneak it across my land. Gregory Langford wasn't protecting the neighborhood. He was selling us out to a multi-billion-dollar corporation for a payout that probably had 6 zeros at the end of it. I snapped pictures of everything. The wires, the industrial-grade steel, the Meridian logo. And just as I was climbing out of the trench, I saw the figure, a man in dark clothing, standing at the edge of the tree line, just watching me with a stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He didn't move when I stared at him. He didn't run. He just turned and vanished into the shadows of the pines like he was part of the forest itself. And I realized then that I wasn't just being intimidated by a suburban board president anymore. I was being surveilled by professionals who had a lot to lose if I kept digging. Margaret called me an hour later, her voice sharp with a new discovery. "Eleanor, I've been digging into the HOA's financials, and they've been receiving substantial payments from Meridian Development for consulting services over the last 18 months. The puzzle was finally complete. The forged signatures, the jurisdictional amendments, the nighttime construction. It was all a coordinated land grab to turn our quiet Thung Lung into an industrial hub for data centers or energy pipelines, and my 20-acre estate was the missing piece they needed to complete the link. I felt a surge of white-hot fury, the kind that makes you lose your fear because you finally understand the scope of the evil you're fighting. They weren't just trespassing on my land, they were trying to annihilate the very idea of it. But Gregory Langford had made one fatal mistake. He assumed I'd be overwhelmed by the legal threats and the safety initiative propaganda. He assumed I was just a woman alone in the woods who didn't know the difference between a gas pipe and a fiber optic conduit. That night, the HOA went nuclear. They low-D the cease and desist. Order Margaret had officially filed and sent a fleet of vehicles to the edge of my property, setting up floodlights that turned the meadow into a stage under a midnight sun. Workers were hauling equipment toward the trench, and I saw Langford himself, dressed in jeans and a button-down, looking smugly at my gate while the machines roared to life. "This isn't your land anymore, Eleanor," he called out over the din of the engines. "Not entirely. You can fight us in court, but progress is a moving train, and it's too late to step off the tracks." I stood there at the gate, clutching my phone with the photos of the Meridian hardware, and I didn't yell. I just told him I knew what was in the pipes. The smile didn't disappear, but it wavered, a flicker of something that looked a lot like panic crossing his face before he masked it with that polished arrogance again. "Bold accusations, Eleanor. I hope you have the evidence to back them up," he said, before turning his back on me to direct a crane toward the trench. And as the industrial pipes were lowered into my soil, I felt a strange sense of clarity. They were escalating because they were desperate. They were rushing because the Meridian deal was probably on a deadline, and if I could hold them off just long enough to get this evidence in front of a judge, the whole house of cards would come crashing down. I went back to the house and spent the rest of the night compiling my findings into a digital dossier for Margaret, my hand steady now because the sanctuary wasn't under siege anymore. It was a trap, and Gregory Langford was walking right into it. The next morning, the retaliatory strike arrived in the form of a bright orange zoning violation notice taped to my front gate, claiming my workshop and my garden structures were unauthorized activities and ordering their immediate demolition. It was a classic pressure tactic, a way to bury me under a mountain of legal issues until I had no choice but to capitulate. But I didn't tear it down. I framed it, a reminder of exactly who I was fighting, and I spent the day gathering every permit I'd ever pulled for the workshop, every tax receipt, every scrap of proof that my life was legitimate. The HOA and Meridian thought they could overwhelm me with their lawyers and their diesel engines, but they had forgotten that I've spent 15 years restoring old, broken things, and I'm very, very good at finding cracks in the foundation. The courthouse was bustling, a sea of suits and briefcases that felt like a different planet from my quiet 20 acres, and as I sat on the wooden bench next to Margaret, I could feel Gregory Langford's eyes on me from across the aisle. He was flanked by a team of lawyers who looked like they were carved out of ice. And Karen Holbrook, the notary who'd stamped my forged signature, was fidgeting with her pearl necklace, refusing to meet my gaze. The air in the courtroom was thick with that peculiar, sterile tension of a high-stakes hearing. And when the judge, a gray-haired man with eyes that looked like they'd seen every lie in the book, called the session to order, I felt a strange, vibrating calm settle over me. Margaret didn't waste a second. She opened with the forged signatures, projecting the crude, messy scribble of my name onto a screen so large the whole room could see the insult of it. And then she moved for the throat. She presented the county records we'd uncovered, the illegal jurisdictional amendments. And then, the piece de resistance, she brought up the photos I'd taken in the trench. The room went silent as the images of the reinforced industrial pipes and the Meridian Development Junction box appeared on the screen, a blatant, metallic contradiction to the community gas line narrative Langford had been peddling. This isn't about safety, Your Honor. Margaret's voice was sharp, a surgical strike in the quiet room. This is about a predatory homeowners association selling out the rights of a private citizen to facilitate a multi-million-dollar industrial corridor for a private corporation. I saw Langford shift in his seat, his polished facade finally starting to crack as his lawyers scrambled to whispered conferences, their community safety, defense crumbling under the weight of the Meridian logo. The real turning point came when Karen Holbrook took the stand. Under Margaret's relentless, methodical cross-examination, the notary's story didn't just leak, it flooded. She couldn't explain why she'd witnessed my signature when I was 30 miles away. She couldn't account for the discrepancies in the dates. And finally, she just stopped talking, her face turning a ghostly shade of white as the reality of a perjury charge started to sink in. And then it was my turn. I stood there looking at the judge. I didn't talk about property lines or zoning codes. I talked about the 15 years of sweat and soul I'd poured into that land. I talked about the workshop where I restored beauty to broken things, and I told him that my sanctuary wasn't a pawn in a corporation's game. They thought they could bully me into submission because I live alone in the woods, I said, my voice steady and clear, but they forgot that the land doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the biggest bank account. It belongs to the person who nurtures it. When the judge finally spoke, the silence in the room was so heavy you could hear the scratch of a reporter's pen from 3 rows back. The evidence of fraud, forgery, and bad faith in this case is not just compelling. It is overwhelming, he declared, his voice booming like a gavel. And he didn't just uphold the cease and desist order. He issued a permanent injunction against the HOA and Meridian, ordering an immediate halt to all construction and a full investigation by the state attorney general into the HOA's financial dealings. Langford looked like he'd been struck by lightning, his polished suit suddenly looking too big for his shrunken frame. And as he was escorted out of the room, I saw the fear in his eyes. He wasn't the visionary anymore. He was just a man facing a very long, very public fall from grace. The victory was sweet, but the healing was slow. In the weeks that followed, a court-ordered team of contractors arrived to remove the industrial pipes and fill the jagged trench that had marred my meadow. And for the first time in months, the sound of machinery didn't feel like an invasion. It felt like a cleanup. The HOA's board was dissolved. Gregory Langford and Karen Holbrook were hit with criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy, and even Meridian Development tried to distance itself from the mess, claiming they were unaware of the HOA's methods while their internal emails, leaked during the investigation, proved they'd been the ones driving the bulldozer. My land remained scarred for a while, the raw dirt a reminder of the battle I'd fought, but nature is a patient restorer. I spent my evenings planting native grasses and wildflowers in the path of the old trench, reclaiming the soil with my own 2 hands. My furniture business started to regain its rhythm, the familiar scent of sawdust and linseed oil providing a normalcy I hadn't felt in a year, and I found myself becoming an accidental advocate for others in the Thung Lung. Neighbors who had been too scared to fight back started showing up on my porch, asking for advice, and together, we formed a coalition to ensure that no group of people would ever try to modernize us out of our own lives again. One evening, as the sun was setting over the rolling hills, casting a warm, golden glow across the meadow where the orange banners had once fluttered, I sat on my porch and watched a deer move slowly through the grass I'd planted. It stopped where the trench had been, sniffing the ground before moving on, and I felt a deep, resonant peace return to the acreage. The sanctuary was mine again, not just because a judge said so, but because I'd fought for it. I'd stripped away the lies and the corporate varnish to find the solid wood underneath, and as the stars began to poke through the twilight, I realized that the fight hadn't just protected my property. It had reaffirmed my life. So, here's the question I want to leave with you tonight. At what point does community progress become corporate theft? And if someone started digging a trench through the middle of your life, would you have the strength to stand at the gate and tell them no? Have you ever dealt with a homeowners association that thought your land was their playground, or a corporation that tried to hide behind a safety initiative? Drop your stories in the comments. I want to know how you defended your sanctuary, or if you're still in the middle of a fight, maybe my story can be the fuel you need to keep digging for the truth. Let's talk about property rights, the audacity of HOA boards, and why the quiet person in the woods is often the last person you should ever try to bully. Hit that subscribe button to join our community of rebels and restorers. And remember, the land remembers who loved it, and it never forgets who tried to break it. I'm Eleanor Thompson, and this acreage is officially, unequivocally, off limits.